Hi everyone. Today we're looking at how Point Pleasant Park has recovered since Hurricane Juan and whether the forest is following the expected Acadian forest succession. Our group used the long-term biology 2060 data set to track how the community has changed over time. Secondary succession occurs when a disturbance removes the forest canopy, but leaves soil and seed banks intact, allowing vegetation to regrow through predictable stages. Hurricane Juan acted as a major reset in Point Pleasant Park by removing much of the canopy and pushing the forest back to early succession. But because Point Pleasant Park is an urban forest, factors like compacted soils and human disturbance may alter or slow recovery. This uncertainty leads to our central question: is the forest following the expected Acadian succession pathway? For this project, we focused on three main objectives. First, we wanted to interpret the long-term forest data collected in Point Pleasant Park from 2004 to 2025. This data set basically lets us track how the forest has changed since Hurricane Juan. Second, we wanted to see whether those changes match what we expect for Acadian forest succession. So things like increases in tree density, shifts in dominant species, and whether late successional species are returning. And finally, we wanted to connect what we observed to broader ecological concepts and think about what this means for managing an urban forest. Point Pleasant Park has a lot of human pressure, so understanding its recovery helps us make better decisions about conservation and restoration.
Our data was collected in Point Pleasant Park, or Amtucati, in Halifax, Nova Scotia. After Hurricane Juan in 2003, 6 permanent 400 square meter plots were established in the most heavily damaged sections of the park. Each year since 2004, excluding years with major weather disturbances in the COVID-19 pandemic, Biology 2060 students have surveyed all trees with a diameter greater or equal to 2.5 centimeters at breast height, which is around 4.5 feet above the ground. We used DBH tapes to measure tree trunk diameter. Tree species counts and DBH were all recorded on standardized field sheets and later compiled in Excel for analysis. The data was analyzed using linear regression to evaluate how total tree density, dominant species abundance, and community diversity changed between 2004 and 2025. This method was chosen because it clearly shows long-term directional changes, which are key indicators of succession in the park.
Today we'll be answering the following questions.
This slide shows how total tree density in Point Pleasant Park has changed from 2004 to 2015. When we averaged the Biology 2060 plot data by year, we saw a strong upward trend in density, meaning the forest has been steadily filling back since Hurricane Juan. The linear regression supports this. The R-square value of 0.87 shows that most of the variation density is explained by time, and the p-value below 0.001 tells us the trend is statistically significant. Together, this is strong evidence of active post-disturbance recovery. For quality control, all values fell within expected ecological ranges, so we didn't need to remove any outliers. Overall, this graph shows that Point Pleasant Park is progressing through early succession as expected, with young trees becoming more abundant over time. For our first research question, we wanted to know how the forest community in Point Pleasant Park has changed from 2004 to 2025 and whether it's actually following the recovery pattern we'd expect for an Acadian forest after a major disturbance like Hurricane Juan. Based on ecological succession theory, our hypothesis was that the forest should show three main patterns over time. First, an overall increase in total tree density as new stems established. Second, a gradual return of late successional species, especially red spruce, which is a key Acadian forest species. And third, an increase in community diversity and structural complexity as the forest matures. This question basically sets up the rest of our analysis, where we look at whether it's the long-term Biology 2060 monitoring data actually match those expectations.
In response to the second research question, we expect to see a change in the dominant species between 2004 and 2024. However, we think that the original dominant species will remain, but a new dominant species will have appeared and then increase much faster over time. This is a linear regression on the density of red spruce in Point Pleasant between 2004 and 2025. It has a p-value of 0.0004, which means that it is statistically significant and here is a good indicator for density. However, because the R-squared value is 0.13, that means that only 13% of the variation that we see in the density is actually accounted for by the year. However, it is important to note that it is still a positive trend upwards, which means that the density of red spruce is increasing over the years. Very similarly to the last slide, this is a regression analysis on red maple in Point Pleasant Park, and this one has a p-value of 0.0003, which means that it is once again statistically significant, and it has a very similar R-squared value of approximately 0.13, which again means that only 13% of variation in density is accounted for by time. As we saw in the last two slides in figure 2 and 3, both species have increased in density since 2004, but red maple has increased much faster at a rate of around 2.2 trees per 400 meters squared per year, as we can see in the equation on the graph, as opposed to 0.3 trees for spruce, according to our linear regression. On the right-hand side of the slide here, we have figure 4, which are the equations from our linear regressions earlier, and this just helps us to visualize that red maple is increasing much faster, even though at the very beginning in 2004 there were more spruce trees than there were red maple in terms of density. This makes sense with what we know about these trees, because after an environmental disruption on a forest that causes secondary succession, which is what we're seeing, there's a loss of canopy, which means there's a lot of sun on the forest ground, giving sunlight to smaller plants that don't usually get a lot of sunlight due to the canopy. The red maple is only slightly shade tolerant as opposed to the spruce that is very shade tolerant. So with this excess sunlight, it's able to very quickly grow. On the other hand, the red spruce grows more slowly than the red maple. So the red maple is a more dominant species right now, but we are in the early stages of succession. And the red spruce is a late successional species because even in the shade, when the maples sort of start to see limited growth, they will be able to continue to grow and increase in density. Analyzing these changes are really important because Point Pleasant Park is a public park and it's under the care of the Halifax government, and they need to know how to appropriately care for the forest and know when to intervene. So by doing this research and determining if the changes we're seeing in our forest are natural or a result of human interference, it's very important in terms of how we choose to continue to care for the park.
Figure 5 shows how the Shannon Diversity Index, a measure of both species richness and evenness, has changed in Point Pleasant Park between 2004 and 2025. R-squared is around 0.33 for this analysis, meaning that around 33% of variability is accounted for. The p-value for this data is 1.4 times 10 to the negative 8, meaning it is statistically significant. The Shannon Diversity Index is approximately 2.04 times larger in 2025 than in 2004. We can see both visually and statistically a steady increase in diversity over time, meaning that the forest community has become more complex since Hurricane Juan. We want to look at how the Shannon Diversity Index has changed over time and use this information to predict what will happen to this measure as the forest reaches its climax community. Right after the hurricane, diversity was low because the community was destroyed and only a few pioneer species could quickly establish themselves. Over time, as conditions improved, tree abundance increased, which leads to the redevelopment of the canopy. Now, 22 years after the hurricane, we can see how diversity has continued to steadily increase as the forest goes through these successional changes. We predict that as the forest moves closer to its climax community, diversity will slightly decrease and then level off because the canopy will close and fewer species that require large amounts of light will be able to grow in the shade of the canopy. At that stage, competition will stabilize the community, resulting in a mostly constant diversity.
According to our analysis of biodiversity and the changes in dominant species.
Well, how might these results be practically applied? Based on our results, there are a few practical applications. First, because early stage forests are more vulnerable to invasive species, Point Pleasant Park might be at higher risk during recovery. Studies also show that invasive plants can spread quickly after disturbance, which makes this something to monitor closely. We already know that species like multiflora rose and Japanese knotweed are present in Point Pleasant Park, so these findings can help the city decide where to prioritize removal or monitoring. Overall, our results can help guide restoration efforts like choosing which species to plant and can help support long-term management decisions to keep the forest moving towards a healthy Acadian forest trajectory.
Are there any invasive species in Point Pleasant Park? Yes, there are currently species such as the multiflora rose and Japanese knotweed patches. Is the park more susceptible to invasive species during succession? Also, yes, early successional communities are known to be more invasible than communities in later successional stages due to its composition, species richness, and biomass. Invasive species are also often more well adapted to be able to thrive in an early successional environment, allowing them to take over. What is the impact they may have on the growth of the forest? The impacts of early species is disproportionately high due to the founder effect. They can inhibit colonizing species, and seemingly similar species can exhibit very different behaviors in successional communities, which makes it very hard to predict the exact effect that invasive species will have. However, we can infer that they will likely have a negative impact on the post successional growth of the forest, and intervention by park management will likely be required.
Gaps in the canopy of a forest create spots where sunlight is abundant. In these spots, species that perform more sunlight, like red maple, can grow and eventually develop into mature individuals. These mature individuals fill in the gaps in the canopy, creating an upper layer of shade-intolerant species. Underneath this canopy, shade-tolerant species can take advantage of resources to dominate the undergrowth and fill in any remaining gaps with poor sunlight exposure, becoming more abundant as successional stages progress.
We would like to start off by acknowledging that the land we did our research on belonged to the Mi'kmaq people. We would also like to thank Dalhousie University for giving us the resources to do this research, as well as Professor Zaguris, who coordinates and supervises our lab and research, as well as conducted our data analysis. Lastly, we would like to thank all past Biology 2060 students who collected the data that we used in our research.